or something.
Yeah, there's
They're just testing to see, oh my gosh, it really works.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming. I'm Davis Farmer. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. And it's a great pleasure to have you here this evening. We think we're going to have a pretty interesting program. Just a little background. World Affairs Council has a history going back to probably 1915 or so, 1920.
1954.
Well, our council goes back to 1954. The original one goes back to the 1920s. It was formed right after the First World War, and its mission was to inform people in this country about things that go on outside of this country that affect us. And that's still our mission today. So we consider our job being to inform and provide people with access to first-rate speakers and events.
When you can get them, and otherwise.
It's incumbent upon me to say that we're a non-profit and non-partisan organization. We're supported by our members and by donations. We would be delighted, if you're not a member yet, to have you consider joining. Frankly, I think our membership is ridiculously inexpensive and great value. So if you're all interested, please speak to Tim or somebody with one of these badges afterwards, or go on our website and check it out. And now I'm going to introduce our co-sponsor for this evening, Kimberly Kersey-Asbury, who's representing the Fulbright Foundation.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm Kimberly Kersey-Asbury. I'm Associate Professor of Studio Arts at St. Anselm College, and I'm Vice President of the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association, a co-sponsor of these presentations today. The Fulbright Association is a nonprofit organization constituted to support the Fulbright program, which is an educational exchange program of the United States Department of State. The Fulbright program operates as a partnership between the United States and local governments in over 160 countries, with funding coming from both the U.S. and foreign governments. It is an exchange program, so there are roughly equal numbers of Americans going abroad and foreign citizens coming to the U.S. There are a variety of different Fulbright grant opportunities. Grants to conduct independent study abroad, grants to pursue research, a degree or a certificate at a foreign university, grants to teach English in elementary or secondary schools abroad, grants to teach at foreign universities, grants for civil servants or other citizens with special expertise to learn how other places work or teach them how we do things. Grantees are often young, just beginning to build a career, but there are many senior Fulbright fellows as well. I want to encourage everyone here, both students and non-students, to look into the program and see whether there is something there that would enrich your life or advance your career or help others. Participating in the Fulbright program excuse me, is a life-changing experience, and I do speak from personal experience on that. I was in Botswana for my own Fulbright project, and I'd be happy to talk about it at the end if anyone's interested. Closer to home, the Fulbright Association here in New Hampshire seeks to orchestrate interesting and educational experiences for the Fulbright alumni, to support Fulbright scholars visiting from abroad, and to engage in activities that aim to keep the Fulbright program strong. We believe that the kind of outreach embodied in the Fulbright program is an essential and vital part of American diplomacy, and I invite you to help us support this important program. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kimberly, and thank you to the Fulbright chapter here in New Hampshire. They've been a great supporter, a great sponsor of these programs over the past several years, and we're really excited to continue the partnership moving forward. You can thank them for the food out in the back. If you do want to get up and, if you're in person, want to grab some food, or I guess if you're at home, you can get up and grab food as well. But my name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Really excited to have this conversation tonight. This is the second in our T. William and Patricia Ayers Global Tipping Point series on making sense of the world. We are taking different approaches, different ways in which you can look at the world. We kicked off about a month ago talking about the realism school of thought and how that can be applied to understanding the world. Tonight we're here with amazing Ambassador Storella to talk about multilateralism, allies, what are they actually good for, if anything. I'll let you answer that question. We are also thankful to Southern New Hampshire University, our mission partner, for everything we do. They are a great supporter of our programs and our organization. We would not be where we are today, both in terms of location and strength of the organization without the wonderful support of the university. Okay, with all of that out of the way, one more introduction, and I'm going to pull up your online bio here, Ambassador, because I want to get this right, and the State Department tends to give long titles. Some of the things that Ambassador Storella has had the pleasure of participating in, his ambassadorship was to the country of Zambia. He has a 30-plus year career with the Foreign Service, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for State, Population, Refugees, and Migration, and the Dean of the Leadership and Management School of the Foreign Service Institute. Not sure how you get either of those onto a business card without really tiny font.
Small print.
Yes. Other postings included Deputy Chief of Mission in Brussels, at the U.S. Mission to the UN in Geneva and in Phnom Penh. He is the recipient of the Presidential Rank Award, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Excellence in Service Award, the Thomas Jefferson Award presented by American Citizens Abroad, and several other State Department awards. You are having the pleasure of hearing from someone who has a great and wonderful background, who has experienced this firsthand over many decades, and I'm just excited to hear what you have to say and then get into a bit of a moderated Q&A. So thank you.
Tim and everyone here, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be in New Hampshire. I love New Hampshire, even though I come from a state which will go unnamed to the south. We used to come up here for vacation, Camp Lafayette. I love the Flume. My brother went to Dartmouth, and even though I didn't go to Dartmouth, I'm very fond of Dartmouth. But more than anything else, I love your license plates. And I love your license plates because live free or die is in many respects really the sentiment that was the animus for me in joining the Department of State and trying to serve the American people as best as I could. We are meeting today on this question with a group that I know knows a lot about these issues already, of what are allies good for, and we mean that really broadly. We're not talking just about NATO and Japan. We're talking about friends and partners, Ukraine, Israel, but also the really hard sell. And the hard sell is, what about all those organizations? All those UN organizations that when I was studying a million years ago, some of my professors used to call globaloney. So we're going to talk about them too. They're the hardest part. But I want to start with a very basic question about diplomacy, which is what I did for actually 36 years. I don't put the real number there because people might be able to figure out just how old I am. I'm constantly asked by students, and for that matter, young diplomats, well, what is the purpose of diplomacy? And I ask them, and they will often say, well, it has to do with building bridges and creating links and reaching common understanding, and then I cut them off. And I say, no. The purpose of diplomacy is to advance your national interests. The purpose of American diplomacy is to advance the interests of the American people. And that's all we do. I hope that we do it, though, and I really firmly believe this about the United States, that we have been uniquely capable of doing that in an enlightened way, in a way that really sees the broad interests of our people, and in so many ways identifies the interests of others with our own interests, so we actually get to move ahead together. So, I want to say as a fundamental principle, diplomacy, alliances, our work with international organizations, our assistance to foreign countries, it's not charity. It's to serve the interests of the American people. So, we're going to divide this into a few areas, and I know it's very difficult. People tell me never do anything that has more than 3 parts. So I'm going to say there are 3 parts to why allies and international organizations matter to the United States. The first is basic security. We're going to talk about that. The second is one word, China. And the third is global challenges. We'll talk about each one of those. Security in many respects is not a hard sell. The United States has this tradition of isolationism, going all the way back to the farewell address by George Washington, written by Alexander Hamilton, incidentally, even though they don't get to call it Hamilton's farewell address since he wasn't president. But we learned that what goes on overseas matters to us, and we can't be aloof. World War I, we waited a long time, we finally got into it, and we ended up losing 106,000 soldiers in that war. And then we withdrew again, and we withdrew from international organizations, including the League of Nations, as you all know. Next thing we know, we have another person, another authoritarian making trouble in Europe, and one making trouble in East Asia, and we get sucked in again. But this time we lose 500,000 people. That's when the United States, and the people that are often referred to as the greatest generation, made a firm decision that the United States has to remain engaged. And we have to remain engaged for our own security. And that's where all those institutions came from. In the midst of all of these dangers, when you think about multilateral organizations, you tend to think of the UNGA, the UN Security Council, maybe the World Health Organization. The most important multilateral organization to the United States is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is a multilateral organization. And even though it's a security organization, I know, I was on the NATO desk, I served in Brussels, it's really very much a political alliance. And what do alliances mean for the United States? I want to say to you that our security alliances are America's superpower. We have something no one else has. Our allies are free countries. They're countries that are prosperous because we help make them prosperous. They're countries that, if you're thinking about US security, they implement the strategy that is the fundamental cornerstone of the doctrine for NATO, forward defense. What does forward defense mean? Very simply, if there's going to be trouble, we want to deal with it over there, not over here. And that meant, for doctrine, that if the Soviets, in the days when I was studying all this and working on the NATO desk, came across the line, we wanted the fight to be in the Warsaw Pact, not on German soil. But really, for Americans, what we really want is to make sure if there is such a fight, it's in Europe and not in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where it could be. But the best defense, obviously, is a war that's deterred, not one that we fight. But that's not the hard question, I bet, for this group. I bet almost all of you think, yeah, that sounds reasonable. The real question is it a good deal? The United States is spending 3.5% of its GDP on security. You all know that NATO allies are being asked to spend 2% on security. Does anyone know how many of our 36 NATO allies have reached 2%? Was that? 1 or 2. It's better than that. Okay, well, this is an odd quiz, but I guess I'm a little bit surprised you guys are shooting so low. It's actually half, 18. But still, that's only half, and that's only recently, honestly. Many of them have bounced up. I'm going to talk about this more later. Throughout my career, we've been pushing burden sharing. The United States must not be the only country that pays for all of this. So I've spent tons of time kicking our allies, whether it's Europe or Japan, in the backside saying, we need you to buy weapons, we need you to put soldiers in the field, we need you to help base our soldiers overseas. There's a problem, and I don't want to deny it. I really don't. But when we look at what's going on today, we just passed a $95 billion aid bill for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of your money, a lot of my money too. And we have to think about, well, does that make sense? And are others carrying their fair share? Well, it turns out that Europe actually, until about 20 minutes ago, when President Biden signed this thing, had donated more to Ukraine than the United States had. And actually, based on GDP, almost all European countries were spending more to help defend Ukraine than the United States. And that's not all they've done. They've welcomed 6 million refugees from Ukraine in Europe. There are about 125,000 that we've welcomed in the United States. All of this is to say that there are different pieces of burden sharing. And we should recognize that our allies are doing some things that don't show up in that simple number of 2%. The other thing is, our allies aren't global powers. They don't have big nuclear arsenals. They don't have to have Indo-PACOM in Hawaii, because they don't have ships out there. But we do, so there are reasons why we spend more. Who here has been to China lately? Anyone? Raise your hand. No. Do you have an idea what's going on there? I was just in Shanghai a couple of months ago, and Shanghai makes New York look like a small town. 26 million people, skyscrapers way bigger than in New York, not a single pothole. Coming from Boston, I have a real interest in potholes. And we were walking by, and I said, oh, look, it was a family trip, to my sons and my wife, look, there's a pothole. Wow, we found a pothole. We went in and had lunch. When we came out, they were fixing it. They were fixing the pothole. China is a completely different kind of challenge for the United States from anything we've ever seen before. This is not the USSR. You've heard the famous John McCain say that the USSR is a gas station with nukes. Well, that is not what China is. They are producing everything. And we have got to be strong. And one of the things that we're seeing that I think is really dangerous is that China is now doing something it never did before. They used to have one ally. Does anyone know who their one ally was? North Korea. Who wants North Korea as an ally? I've been to North Korea. This hand has shaken the hand of Kim Jong-il twice. The food is lousy to begin with, but it's an impoverished prison. That's their ally. But now, they're taking advantage of what's going on in Ukraine and reaching out to Russia and making Russia an ally that's subordinate to them. They're reaching out to Iran. North Korea is still there. Syria. They're making an attempt to build an alliance of the type that we have. We can talk more about the economic aspects, but frankly, what China's doing makes our alliances more valuable, really, than ever. So I want to talk about global challenges. The global Oni. One of my friends, Sichan Sip, who was a Cambodian refugee, came to the United States from Pol Pot's killing fields to become a refugee in the United States. And he ended up rising to be an ambassador to the United Nations. In his office at the United Nations, he had this terrific poster from this movie. You probably remember this movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And he used to say to everyone in his office, well, I'm working with all these international organizations, and I want you to know it's the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there are no excellent. Just the good, the bad, and the ugly. Some of you have heard of UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. They recently had a real breakthrough. They designated the French baguette as an intangible cultural world heritage. Why would we want to pay for that? I don't know. I like baguettes. I like croissant even more. I think croissant will be next. But in any event, there are ridiculous things that go on in international organizations. We've seen UN peacekeepers get involved in sexually abusing the people they're supposed to be protecting. And all of this is costing the United States $10 billion a year. That's not $95 billion, but it's real money, $10 billion. Why do we care about being in those organizations? And what do they do for us? What do they do for you? What do they do for you personally? So has anyone here taken an international flight lately? Okay, many people have. You know what? Could not work without ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Authority. It establishes all the rules that permit airplanes to land anywhere around the world. Has anyone used GPS lately? I used it to get to the parking lot, believe it or not.
How about the door?
Pardon me?
It ended at the wrong door.
Entered the wrong door. I actually went in the wrong direction too. It turns out GPS isn't perfect, but actually the person using the GPS wasn't perfect. GPS works because the International Telecommunications Union sets global standards so that all those satellites are beaming information on the same frequencies. And without it, we would not have that. Has anyone heard of something called WIPO? It's the World Intellectual Property Organization. It makes it possible for American businesses to register a patent in one place at WIPO that applies all around the world. And $6.6 trillion of the American economy depends on our intellectual property rights. Now, there are a lot of issues there too, because they're abused and stolen, and that's a major issue. But without WIPO, our businesses couldn't operate overseas protecting all their patents. So I want to talk about global challenges that I mentioned. We're living through them. Climate change, we know that we're not going to be able to solve climate change by ourselves. We cut our greenhouse gases and the Chinese don't. We just lose economically and we don't gain anything. Migration, if we cannot stop people from moving south of our border, they end up at our border. And then they become our problem. Cyber, a whole new area with AI that is now unregulated, where somewhere, someone's got to find a way to regulate this. And then pandemics and global health. So I spent a lot of time working at the World Health Organization in Geneva, where I was the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States. The budget of the World Health Organization is smaller than the budget of Mass General Hospital, otherwise known as man's greatest hospital. It's a little bit bigger than Boston University, where I teach right now. They don't have that big a budget. And the money that we give to them, we're their biggest donor, and we're the biggest donor for just about every international organization. 80% of it is made up of voluntary contributions. We get to choose what we spend it on and what they will spend it on. It's not a tax on us per se. So that $10 billion, actually 80% of it are donations we choose to make, not donations that are taxed. The other 20% are assessed contributions. I'm going to end though right now by saying, well, let me just say that about WHO. Who here's gotten a flu shot? Okay, me too. And have you any idea how they get the vaccine for the flu shot? Well, I don't want to go into the science too much, but there is a seasonal flu in the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere, and you have to check what the flu viruses are that are going around to determine what is going to come to the northern hemisphere during our flu season. How do we do that? WHO organizes a system called GISRIS, Global Influenza Surveillance, blah, 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 which collects specimens all over the world, and twice a year, doctors meet in Geneva and look at the specimens and say, well, what's the most likely thing to hit? How do we make the best vaccine? If we didn't have that surveillance network, we couldn't possibly create a vaccine that would protect people. That's one of the things WHO does. I'm going to end with a story about Belgium. It turns out that those folks up there, at Fairchild, see them right there? Two of my friends and colleagues from the Department of State. We served together in Belgium. It was an exciting post, more exciting than I wanted. I spent all of my time doing really one thing, trying to sell F-35 fighters to the Belgians. And they're super expensive. They're nearly 100 million a pop. And they're really expensive. They didn't want to buy them. So our ambassador, Denise Campbell-Bauer, and I, and others from the embassy, visited every single cemetery, every single grave of any American soldier who died and was buried in Belgium. And there are plenty, because the Battle of the Bulge, the bloodiest battle of World War II, was fought principally in Belgium. Why did we do it? To remind the Belgians that they owed their security to us, that they have a debt to us too, that they need to ante up. And one of these was Battle of the Bulge, and we went to Bastogne. Has anyone here been to Bastogne? It's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah, it's tremendous. One of the greatest battles of World War II. And they have a celebration every year. They call themselves the most American city in Europe. The ambassador is always the guest of honor. And this year, 70th year, the King Philippe, and his wife, Queen Mathilde, who's actually from that area, came. And because it was the 70th, we had a lot of American veterans there. They're all 80, 85 years old, many in wheelchairs. They greeted each one of them. And when it was over, they came to me and they said, we'd like to invite them to the palace tomorrow. We go to the palace the next day. They had set up in this beautiful ballroom tables around, and they split up, the king and the queen. They have 4 children, 2 went with each, and they went to each table and talked with the veterans. And when it was over, I said to the king, Your Majesty, we are very touched by what you've done for our veterans on this anniversary. And he looked at me and he said, my wife and I, we just wanted to make sure that our children had a chance to meet the people who liberated their country. A year later, they bought F-35, which incidentally, BAE Systems here in Manchester helps manufacture. Why do we do these things? Because it's in our interest. What do we want America to be in the world? We want us to be, frankly, the America that does great things. We want us to be the America that people look up to. And we want us to be the America that our allies want to stand with. That's why we do these things with allies and international organizations. So thank you very much. Look forward to chatting and to hearing your questions.
Yeah, well, thank you. Sorry, it sounds like our mics are a little close to each other. So I appreciate hearing all of that again. We've talked extensively prior to this, but I still love hearing these stories and your experiences. So thank you for sharing with us. What I want to start the conversation with is a just sort of broad overview, and then we'll sort of bring it down, and then of course we want to invite our audience both here in person and online to give us your questions as well. If you're online, please send us it through email at council@wacnh.org or through the YouTube chat as well. I have my devices here, so I will be checking those. I am not checking sports scores or asking my wife what's for dinner. But so let's talk in this international space. We are seeing a rise of geopolitical conflict, of geopolitical strife with great powers that we haven't seen in 30 years. You mentioned climate change. You mentioned some of these bigger issues, AI, that we need to come together as a world to regulate. But my question to you is, first and foremost, is that possible? Is it possible for the UN to continue to function when Russia and China are on one side vetoing everything we want to do, and we are on the other side vetoing everything they want to do?
Tim, that is a terrific question, and unfortunately, I wish you'd give me an easy one first. Not such an easy question. I think that the answer to that is that we should recognize there's a global challenge going on to the order that the United States built after World War II with friends and allies. It's sometimes referred to as the liberal international order. And some countries, honestly, if you ask me, have benefited magnificently. The country that has benefited the most is China. We welcomed China into the World Trade Organization. We permitted them to receive investment from the United States, from our allies, and from Japan. We made that tremendous growth that I saw in Shanghai possible. I think that right now, unfortunately, China and Russia feel they've had enough of American influence, and they see these instruments not as instruments that serve the world, but as instruments that actually serve the United States. I don't think that's correct, because as you know, I think that we have an enlightened approach. They're serving us and others. But actually they're right in that the United States has more influence there than they do. So for instance, the World Bank. There's an agreement, the World Bank leader will always be an American. That gives us tremendous influence. So what did China do? They established their own Asian infrastructure investment bank to challenge us. we want to guide them in the direction of being cooperative, but honestly, it hasn't worked very well. So my answer to your question is that these institutions continue to work, but they become wobbly if our support for them becomes wobbly. And I mean, I just want to tell you all, I don't know how many of you have been in any kind of situation like this. You imagine that people around the world somehow sneer at the United States or resent the United States. I've served in 10 different countries overseas representing the United States. People actually are hungry for American leadership. So I think that if we are strong ourselves, and you saw it just happen in Ukraine, when that attack took place, the United States actually jumped in, rallied NATO, and I think the Russians were deeply and badly surprised, which is exactly what we want. So the answer is yes, but it requires leadership and commitment and steadiness.
And we've seen some wobbliness in the U.S. commitment to some of these international organizations, particularly World Health and the UNHCR, others, of course. But why do we want to stay engaged? Why do we want to stay involved in these when, you know, the chairmanship of the Human Rights Commission goes to a country like China? Is that something that we give leverage and support to that when they are the ones who get the opportunity to lead it?
Well, people here like football? I hope so. Who doesn't like football? Do you ever try to play football without an offensive line? Not going to work. It's not going to work. If the United States abandons the field, what will happen? Frankly, the Chinese will move in and they will run those institutions. We just saw this play out recently in the fight over the leadership of the International Telecommunications Union. Did we want a Chinese candidate to win? In which case, guess what? I bet Huawei's standards would end up being adopted. Or did we want a Singaporean or somebody friendly with the United States to be in charge? It was a hard fight. But we didn't abandon the field, and our candidate won. I worked in the UN Human Rights Council. In fact, it happens, curiously, I was the first US representative to the UN Human Rights Council. People, for the most part, countries joined that not because they love human rights. They joined it to defend their bad practices. So you need to go in there as a complete cynic and recognize these are not a bunch of nice human rights loving people. That's not what they're about. But you can make the arguments and you can win on things. On one of the votes, Zambia voted in our favor on something related to human rights in Sudan. They broke with all the other African countries. And I was sort of astonished. It was the day I fell in love with Zambia. What did I find out later on? I found out that the niece of the ambassador was named Eleanor. And I asked why. We named her after Eleanor Roosevelt. There are people all over the world who believe in the principles that we have been espousing and supporting. And believe it or not, sometimes when the chips are down, they will come out and push in the direction we want. And we shouldn't give that up.
So in terms of seeing that effort, again, in this geopolitical space of great power competition, let's take a look at Russia, Ukraine. The US and the West have pushed for sanctions. Many countries have not joined in that for any number of reasons. But do you see, as China and Russia want to push as a narrative, a decline in US global leadership that should allow for more space for China and Russia to set the rules? Or do we still have the same sway and pull, and what is that based on?
So I'm a diplomat by training, and maybe I'm going to say something to you that's shocking. When I think about what the organizing principle is of the world order, I don't think it's the UN Charter. I think it's American power. And frankly, we have to demonstrate that power, and people will rally to it. They don't, frankly, rally to weakness. What happened today, and what happened over the last few days with Congress passing that bill, that was vital to the position of the United States in the world. and not just in Europe, but perhaps even more important in Asia. The Chinese were watching. And if they're thinking about making trouble in Taiwan, what happened over the last few days in Washington was a really important signal, I think. I'm very dissatisfied, as you might expect, with all the countries that we have supported in so many ways. The American people have spent $110 billion fighting AIDS, mostly in Africa, and many African countries in UN votes abstain. But I'll tell you something, a lot of those UN votes frankly don't matter for much anyway. So I'm not too worried about that. And people tend to think, oh my gosh, they didn't vote with us, we should sanction them. But the word of sanctions that you raised is important. Which countries are going to cut off China and Russia if they support Ukraine? Frankly, we need the big countries that have big economies, but we need the small ones too. So this is part of what diplomacy is, multilateral diplomacy. You're fighting for every ally, for every partner. And I always told our teams, I don't care how small that country is, take that person to lunch and convince them of what it is we want them to do. Because that's the way you build a coalition. We have to keep at it. This is not an argument for disengaging, it's an argument for engaging more.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up with one sort of very specific question here and then invite our audience to have their questions. But in terms of fighting for every last ally and convincing every last country that we can, what are some of the key things that you found throughout your 36-year career that really helped to move the needle? Obviously, knowing that each individual case is very different, but any general ideas or themes, trends that you saw in your work that really helped move the needle in the U.S. interest path?
So there's a term that I really dislike, but here I go, I'm about to use it. Some of you heard of the term soft power. Sounds like a contradiction in terms. But what it means is the ability to get someone to do what you want them to do through attraction as opposed to compulsion. Sometimes you have to compel people, for sure. How does attraction work? Well, there's so many things that are startling, and the people in this room I know have a lot of experience. But the Fulbright program, honestly, we have tens of thousands of alumni from that program who have visited the United States, studied in the United States, and we've sent people there. And those person-to-person contacts, believe it or not, make a gigantic difference. I won't mention the person's name because they probably wouldn't like it, but I was in a Southeast Asian country and asking the family about their family members, and it turns out they had a grandson they named Kennedy. People do that. I worked a lot on HIV and AIDS. And I was really upset. We were spending, I don't even want to tell you how much, but frankly, when I started, $350 million a year on AIDS in Zambia. Zambia is not the most strategically significant country in the world. And I said to the team, I was the ambassador, what are we getting for this? How do we get something for this? And people said, no, don't ask for something. That's not this is humanitarian. It's not the right thing to do. And I thought, okay. So I did whatever I could. I went to every clinic. We opened every clinic. I went to every tribal festival. I don't want to go through all the crazy things we did to bring attention to the fact the United States was doing so much for the Zambian people. And you probably heard of AFRICOM. AFRICOM is the U.S. command that deals with Africa. The Zambians had said, the Zambian president had said, we will not let a single boot of AFRICOM land on our territory. Well, as time passed, it turns out that the Minister of Defense loved the fact that we were saving his soldiers from HIV. And at the very end of my stay in Zambia, whereas China had been the only security partner of Zambia, the Zambians agreed to host the biggest American military exercise in Africa in Zambia. Why? Fundamentally, I think, because they respected us. I also think they wanted to balance China. They didn't like the Chinese that much. But they appreciated the fact that we made an effort on their behalf. Thank you.
All right, we do have a couple of questions coming in online, but of course want to give our in-person audience a first crack at this. Please do wait for the microphone just because we want to make sure the people online can hear us. So Steve, I'll come to you first.
You've been ambassador to a country, not a major power, not a real U.S. ally, to my knowledge. What opportunity in an era where telecommunications are virtually simultaneous does a U.S. ambassador to a country like that have a real opportunity to shape U.S. policy?
Well, Steve, thank you for that question. Let me just start by saying that's when you have the most chance, because Washington may not be looking. If you're in Paris, honestly, Washington's calling them right over your head, but they very rarely would call anybody in Zambia. So you have a lot of room, I think, to influence policy. And you have room for initiatives. We did a huge amount on trade, and we tripled trade because Zambia is the second biggest copper producer in Africa, so China was hugely interested, and our companies were being squeezed out. But we went everywhere showing what American companies could offer, and we landed deals. That was one thing we did. We doubled the size of the Peace Corps. Yeah, biggest Peace Corps in the world.
I was going to mention, you forgot about Peace Corps. Peace Corps has made a big difference in the world.
And I visited every Peace Corps volunteer I could, and these are a scruffy, frowsy group of people. But you know what? They were making friends all over the place, and doubling the size of the Peace Corps was great for us. People loved the Peace Corps. We worked on elections, and actually I had strong pressure from Washington to make sure they were clean elections. And we pushed really hard, and actually they threatened to throw me out of the country, which truly that's actually really good for your career if you're an ambassador. I should have let them do it. It would have been great for me, but I didn't. And in the end, they agreed to count the votes, and the incumbent lost. Doesn't happen that often in Africa. It did. It was shaky. There was almost a trouble on the transition of power, but there was ultimately a peaceful transition of power there. The new president said to me, "You helped us so much by making sure they counted the votes. I want the first event at the president's palace to be in honor of USAID and the Peace Corps." The entire diplomatic corps, including my Chinese ambassador friend, I have to say I really enjoyed this, had to watch him saluting the Peace Corps and USAID. And then what did he do? We said to him, "Look, we're helping you a lot on HIV. You guys aren't spending that much. We know you don't have that much money, but we would like you to match what we're doing." And I said, "We have this much money." The truth is, we're going to give it to them anyway. But I said, if you do that, if you double your pay, what you're paying on HIV, we'll give you this amount of money too. And he did it, and then the next year they doubled it again, and the next year they doubled it again. So I think you can have lots of influence. Who's next?
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador. My name is Sue Tatton, and I am a former Peace Corps volunteer, diplomat with USAID. I was a democracy and governance officer, and Fulbright. I've just spent
The whole package.
the whole package, and I worked for the UN for 10, 15 years, so I've seen it all in very different guises. And what I'm going to ask a question about the current situation in our government, and particularly in Congress, because I'm concerned about the movement towards the right, which is a movement away from the values that you talk about, the liberal values, and more towards an American first policy. And I'm wondering what your views are on the way that the Congress is moving, and what hope we have to return to a more stable approach.
Boy, Sue, I wish I could answer that and solve that problem, but I can't. throughout my career, we love working with Congress. I've hosted a zillion different CODELs, congressional delegations, which is fantastic. I remember my very first tour was in Bangkok, and our ambassador, Bill Brown, used to drive. Has anyone here been to Bangkok? So you've had that drive from the airport. It's terrible. He would drive to the airport and greet every single member of Congress. That means he's spending 2-3 hours on the road. And I remember him saying to us in the country team meeting, you know what? These people are representatives of the American people. They vote. And if I get to spend an hour and a half in the car with a member of Congress, I'll take it. So I would say that for diplomats, we try as hard as we can to take advantage of the opportunities we have to tell Congress about what we're doing. We love working with staffers, congressional staffers. They're often incredibly expert. But the problem you're talking about, Sue, is that in many ways, everyone knows this, that we have a polarization really more than anything else right now in the United States that's making it hard for us to reach agreements on things. I don't want to talk about the underlying politics, and I'm not sure, honestly, Sue, that it's right to blame everything on the right as compared to the left in all of this. But having said that, we used to have this term that politics stopped at the water's edge. It was never 100% the case, but it was much more the case before. Something strange just happened. The Democrats and the Republicans got together on a really major bill. We should all study this and find out what happened and how this happened. I'm not sure I know exactly. I think that there might have actually been some profiles in courage. And we need to, we as American people, as voters, we need to support folks who do that, from my perspective. Anyway, that's not a full answer, but it's a perspective on it. Thank you. Yeah, we're done.
So thanks very much. My name is Wendell Smith, a businessman from Lebanon, Dartmouth.
From Lebanon.
Not working.
I love Lebanon. I love sweet tomatoes.
Went there last night. Though I also love the more or less small size that you personally take attention to, because it's always harder the more the people, and that you can't actually face to face. I don't think anything beats having an hour with another person of any color, nature. I don't say if you have dinner with somebody. Okay, so I've been doing business in China and all these places and loved it, because I was just doing a little business. But we played by their game. Japan, China, and Thailand, and always with a company that made a good product, sold it to us at a very good price. And I think the stability and the size of a presently safe country to live in is going to keep them in a favorable light overall. I'm not going to risk that. What's the value of risking it? I've been thinking also on the other side of things. Today, I believe there may be more people leaving their country out of desperation than ever before, percentage-wise.
That is certainly true.
That's the real thing. I've tried to decide what's the tipping point. If you said safe people that are comfortable, percentage, and unsafe people, percentage, what do you think? If you've got 10% unsafe, we're in deep trouble. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to take China and India, the only two countries that have, say, billion people.
Yeah. So you raise a lot of interesting points. About China, I'm not a China expert, but believe it or not, my interest in foreign affairs started by taking a course in Chinese history in 1977, a long time ago. And I think that there's a weird dynamic in China. The Chinese people are willing to put up with a lot of trouble. When I was in Shanghai, one of the things I noticed was, being from Boston, nobody was jaywalking. Nobody's running red lights. Nobody was speeding. Why? Because there are cameras everywhere, and they will punish you if you do. There's no freedom. Nobody is expressing opinions. I can tell you more about this. I mean, very strange things. Certain parts of Chinese literature that are famous, that the communists used to like, they've been canceled, and now the university students aren't reading them anymore. It's really very strange, but I think that the Chinese people are willing to put up with this because they're still coming from real poverty and from chaos, and a lot of that chaos is the fault of the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution. So people, I think, like that safety that you talk about, but they're not going to like it forever if
They're
there's
not
no.
leaving the country.
Pardon?
They're not leaving the country because it's horrible.
Please go down Commonwealth Ave any day between classes and see how many Chinese students there are there.
Yeah,
350,000 at least right now in the United
They're
States.
not leaving
Half of
because
them
they
stay in the
can't.
United States.
Okay. That's
So a lot of them stay. So anyway, I would say that people like order, but they like order when they're coming from disorder. If they're coming from a relatively orderly situation, you know, they're ready to do more. Americans, of course, believe in live free or die. So I just want to say about the question you posed about people on the move. It's really dangerous. A lot of this has to do with, it's so complicated, I don't really want to go into it all right now, but some of it has to do with climate. Some of it has to do with conflict. I work with UNHCR, the refugee agency, and IWAM, the International Organization for Migration, and ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, for years. And they do great work, but they don't solve humanitarian crises. And Sadako Ogata, who was one of the greatest high commissioners for refugees, Japanese woman, always said there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian crises. We have to find ways to solve the political crises. You know what we can do right now? We need to solve what's going on in Ukraine. Get those 6 million people, give them the opportunity to go home to a country that will be stable and prosperous. But that's not easy, but we're doing the right thing right now. Who's next?
Oh, we can bring in some of the online questions here.
Wait, I have one.
Oh,
Sorry.
sure.
And I'm going to try to answer quicker so we can get more questions.
I have 2 questions, but I'll try and, your answer might not be brief, but my question is brief. So I'm wondering what opinion or comments you have to make on BRICS versus AUKUS, you know, fears, concerns, etc. My other question is completely unrelated, kind of more driven towards the pandemic. And I happen to have lost my father during COVID-19.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. My parents both come from completely different political, you know, backgrounds and values, and they were both divorced and remarried for obvious reasons because of that, among other things. But what were our biggest failures during the pandemic, and what would you have changed if you could have?
So, BRICS versus AUKUS. BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now they're adding some others. AUKUS is Australia, UK, US, working together in the South China Sea on submarines, frankly, to challenge what the Chinese are doing. So what I would say is that AUKUS, to me, I would be working really hard on this issue and basically telling the people who want to join, why do you want to be a stooge of the Russians and the Chinese? Because that's what I think is going on there. But people are doing it, and it's related to your other question, which is that if you look at Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, he said what was going on during early COVID, he called it vaccine apartheid, where we had 70% of Americans vaccinated. There were only 0.3% of people in Southern Africa vaccinated. There are a lot of reasons why that happened. The Chinese took advantage of it. They had a lousy vaccine, or at least a less good vaccine, and they made a big deal that they were donating vaccines. They actually donated very few. But we didn't take advantage of that. We have better vaccines. We have better delivery methods. We have better partners. I wish, frankly, that early on, even in a symbolic way, we had done more to demonstrate the United States was going to help people around the world. A lot of what's going on with BRICS right now, and with those votes in the UN that you see, is a bit of resentment over the way we acted at the very beginning of this. There are reasons why we did. Remember what I said at the very beginning. Why do we do what we do? To serve the interests of the American people, period. How do you convince the American people, okay, we have vaccines, we're sending some to South Africa? Not that easy, but we could have done more. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question here from Anna. She wants to know, what is it that you can tell us about the proper way to deal with allies who are not doing what we want them to, basically. My way, I'll paraphrase that one.
I mean, there's a lot of persistence involved in this, and you work hard in many ways. I think about Belgium and how we finally sold them the F-35s. We tried, honestly, a little bit to shame them. We took all of the, anyone here ever work, anyone ever visit an aircraft carrier? All right, so you know what it's like. When I was a youngster, someone told me, don't ever go on an aircraft carrier because you will lose all objectivity about US defense spending. It is so exciting, you can barely believe it. It's just unbelievable. So what did we do? We took the entire Ministry of Defense top leadership to aircraft carriers to show flight line operations to say, you want our technology, look what it can do. They became partners of ours. What else did we do? We said, look, if you guys get in early on F-35, and incidentally, as I was driving out of Boston, there was a huge BAE sign, maybe some of you seen it, on Route 93. And what is it? It's an F-35. God bless them. If you get in early, we'll let you make some of the parts for this. You can get some of the jobs. They're not all going to New Hampshire. I never said they're not all going to New Hampshire. And so, I mean, that is a little bit of an incentive that we can provide, and we do that. So what do? You do a full court press. You do the public diplomacy part, you work with politicians, you demonstrate the technology's better, you show them that they have some kind of an economic interest in it, and in the end, you say, when the chips are down, who's going to defend you, France or the United States? They know the answer. Excuse me, my French friends, including my mother-in-law's French.
Okay. We have a question also from Betsy. She's interested in knowing a little bit more about the importance of the NATO alliance and its goals beyond just Russia defense.
So the NATO alliance has something called the NATO Treaty Area. Have you ever heard of that? It actually defines the area of operation within that NATO is responsible for. It's Europe and North America. And it has the famous Article 5, an attack against one is an attack against all. I think many of you know this. It has been implemented how many times? Once. Why was it implemented? After 9/11, our allies came to our defense and joined us in fighting in Afghanistan. And they took losses in Afghanistan. So first I would say that thing that used to be called the NATO Treaty Area, it's being expanded. Second, in the last couple of years, NATO has put out strategic statements in which they've identified China as a strategic competitor. So what we're seeing is that NATO is becoming more global in its perspective. There are other things NATO does on different kinds of technology and various kinds of outreach, but mostly they're still a security organization. But what I would say principally is that since 9/11, they're beginning to recognize they have to think more broadly than just Europe.
And should the NATO alliance include Hawaii at this point?
The NATO alliance does include Hawaii.
So it's in the Pacific, and it is not covered under the NATO alliance.
You know what? I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the NATO Treaty Area
Yep.
extends to Hawaii.
Correct, because it wasn't a state when we signed on. It was more.
Boy, Tim, you just tricked me. That was a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I won't bring up the Unicode consortium that apparently regulates emojis and get your insights on that. But Scott is wondering, sort of along the lines of what Sue was talking about in terms of how do we convince people about the importance of alliances? We see a lot of movements, a lot of conversations out there decrying alliances, saying that they're free riders and we're not getting anything, or we're getting a raw deal. So how do we convince people that alliances are, if your opinion is that they are, a good deal for us?
So I grew up in the Cold War, and I felt like we were in a conflict for which our liberty was at stake. And not just our liberty, but we had to worry about things like nuclear weapons. That was actually something people worried about when I was a kid. One of the things that happened was we were victims of our own success. And the Cold War ended, and this is a tremendous victory, for the Cold War to end peacefully. And there were skirmishes in various places, Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, other places. But for the most part, we avoided a great conflict, and we certainly avoided a nuclear conflict. When that ended, there was that period that sometimes is called the unipolar moment, where the United States seemed like the only superpower, and that there was really no challenge. And then people started talking about, do you remember this expression? The peace dividend. Yep. We're not going to have to spend money on defense. And I spent a lot of time in Europe and Japan trying to convince our allies, no, you know what? Although we were taking advantage of the peace dividend too, but actually do not be complacent. And so I think the fight that we face on this is to overcome complacency, to remind people that the world is still a scary place. I used to give speeches in Belgium saying, you guys do not imagine you don't need those F-35s, because if you have them, you may not have to use them. But if you do not have them, the Russians are still there, and they're not going away. It's a big country, and they're not nice. So we try to convince them. There's an expression, we'll go back to the French, Raymond Aron, French realist thinker, said that in international relations you have only three tools. You have bribes, you have threats, and you have reason. We have to use all of them. And with your allies, you should try not to use too many threats. But certainly we bribe them and tell them you can have part of this consortium, and we reason with them and say, look what you're facing. People are waking up now, it's late, and you see Europe does not have the ability to produce munitions. Actually, we don't have the ability to produce the munitions we need. And so we're playing catch up.
All right, I think this will be the last question. It's a tough one, especially for a diplomat, because it involves specific countries that Rob is asking about here. But he wants to know, how do we better deal with our sometimes problematic strategic allies in Turkey and Russia, Hungary. How do we deal with them when they are moving more authoritarian, they are not upholding our values, and don't do what we want them to in the NATO alliance when we ask them?
That is definitely not an easy question, and not one that can be answered quickly. Any of you folks been to Turkey? What do you think?
Loved it.
Great.
Great place.
Best breakfast ever. Not that I'm all about food, but we have great breakfast. It's a great country, and one of the big problems we face, I think, is that we do not control something they really want. They want a close relationship with the EU. And I won't say which country this was in, but I remember speaking with a diplomat and asking, well, are you folks ever going to let Turkey into the EU? And he said, no, we cannot do that. They are Muslim. Yeah, that's what he said. Senior diplomat, one of our allies. I think that we have to appeal to Turkey differently, and we have a lot of ways to do it. But they are seeing themselves now differently. They are seeing their role in the world really much more like the old Ottomans, like a regional hegemon, which I don't think is really right. I think what we have to do is keep showing them that they have an interest in their alliance with us. There's a terrible thing that happened where they bought Russian missiles. That was going to compromise our ability to share with them technology related to my favorite airplane, the F-35. And we've got to reverse that. We've got to convince them that they need to tie their security to us, and not to the Russians. So this is not easy. I don't really have a good answer to this question. As regards Hungary, Hungary is a small country that has gone in a rather rightward direction, and unfortunately a rather pro-Russian direction. And that's really troubling because they're NATO allies. And they're only one. They held up for a long time Sweden, along with Turkey, Sweden's admission into NATO. Honestly, I think a lot of our soft power can make a difference there. A lot of things like Fulbright and American businesses being active there. Our business people, they don't think they're diplomats, but they are. And so I think this is a long game we have to play with Hungary. Hungary, so folks who've been to Hungary, who's been to Hungary here? Seems like the same people, don't it? But Hungary, I think, really suffered under communist rule. And I think that the Hungarian people, there's a kind of hard side to them. And they haven't really, to me, they haven't really completely overcome, as many other countries in Eastern Europe have, that terrible period of Soviet domination. So I hope things will go better in the future, but not easy.
Well, as all of our conversations, we do have one more question, but as I walk up there, as all of our conversations go here at the World Affairs Council, none of these answers are easy.
Your combination of Belgium and the F-35 strikes me very personally. My heritage is Belgian.
Where from?
On both sides of the family.
Where?
Flemish.
Flemish, where?
My father's hometown, I cannot remember. He was born there. My mother's family comes from Blummerty.
I'm not sure I've been there. All right.
Little villages. And my other heritage is 27 years in the United States Air Force. So when you married the F-35 to Belgium, I said, I've got to ask a question. And of course, the basic fundamentals, you talked a lot about soft power. But my question is this, is where does the United States military stand as far as our position in the world totally is?
So, I mean, you spent 27 years in the Air Force, and so I shouldn't speak for you, but here I go. First, many people in the United States, maybe not people in this room, people are, I think, quite well informed, but a lot of people think people in the military are bellicose and warlike and want to see combat. And well, there's a certain, I don't know what, testosterone thing on that. Honestly, my experience in the military is that's not at all what they want, because they know what happens in war. They're very much committed to deterrence. One of the best things that I think we do in the world, believe it or not, is stationing military overseas. Now, there are a variety of reasons why that can be problematic, but usually those folks are actually very good representatives of the United States overseas. So I think U.S. military play a vital role actually in building alliances. I also am a huge fan of IMET, International Military Education and Training. I think that when we send, I know it doesn't always work, but when we send foreign military people to bases in the United States to train with our soldiers, airmen, Navy and Marines, I think that we end up getting people who understand us better and frankly like us better. And then there's a last thing that I'll say, which is that, and you're in the Air Force, so you're not gonna like this, but honestly, some people have this odd idea that people in the military aren't smart. The truth is that, you got 1.5 million people in the military. The folks who make it up to general officer level, these folks have gone through an amazing winnowing process, and they frequently, I've worked with them. You get there, you got this big brash person, and yeah, they also have a master's degree from Princeton, and not Dartmouth. But where I was going to go that you're not going to like is, believe it or not, I found the people that Americans think are the toughest and roughest, the Marines, produce some of the best military intellectuals. So I think people overseas are often super impressed with not just the ability of our military, not just their work ethic, which is impressive, but also their intellectual engagement with the world. So I'm not sure if anyone will be surprised, but people in the State Department love working with the military.
All right. I've been asked for just one final question. We are on the final farewell tour of this conversation, but.
Thanks, this should be an easy one, so I forgot to say my name earlier, Nicolette Reed, I do export.
Nicolette, I totally doubt this is gonna be easy, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so from a globally speaking, not individually country speaking, because I've heard very different opinions on this, is there an overpopulation issue or an underpopulation issue?
Easy, right?
Who here remembers a book called The Population Bomb? When I was in high school, this book came out, The Population Bomb. And they said, we're going to be in big, big trouble because of overpopulation. And that was when we had something like 3 billion people in the world, and we now have 7 or 8 billion people in the world. I think that our problem is not overpopulation per se, because it turns out we can actually be very productive in terms of doing things like producing food and education and healthcare. We're actually very capable of doing those things. But I think that we're going to have to reform the way we interact with the world. Climate's a big issue. When we think of carbon dioxide production, if everyone's driving a car, we're in big trouble. If you have the 7 billion with a car. Believe it or not, one of the problems is not poverty, but it's wealth. As folks become richer, they consume more, and they produce more of the things that are creating problems with the environment. So I don't think that we have a problem with overpopulation per se. But pardon?
Or under, because that was the conflicting thing I've heard, that some people say there's an underpopulation issue, like Elon Musk, and some people say there's an overpopulation issue. So do you think
Nicolette, I'm just going to say I think all those things are goofy. Because my personal view is what we want is quality of life. It's a different direction. I believe very deeply that we need to be committed to human dignity. What we really want is to be able to have a world in which all the people have an opportunity to have a dignified life, and certainly in the United States. So is the United States overpopulated? I don't think so. Do we have a problem with homeless? Yes, we do. Do we have a problem with pollution? Actually, much less than when I was a kid. The Charles River was absolutely dangerous. You used to have to get a tetanus shot if you fell into the Charles River, and now you can swim in it. So it is possible. Your question's a very hard one. I don't think I can answer it correctly, to be honest. But I think the most important thing is to provide a dignified life to the degree that we can for other human beings, and to do it in a way that doesn't destroy the planet.
So I think the underpopulation gets to the idea of aging demographics in advanced economies, and so you have this potential issue for slowdown in economic growth and the systems that have been created to provide that dignified life. So that might be where the underpopulation idea is coming from.
Okay, well, it turns out that the United States is still growing in population, where China actually reached peak population 2 years ago and reached peak working age population about 10 years ago. And Russia is declining population, Japan is declining, Italy is declining, South Korea is declining precipitously. And yes, there's definitely going to be a problem with not having enough young people to support the elderly. And people are living longer. Although people are able to live longer and be more productive nowadays than they used to be able to. This is sort of controversial. I believe in immigration. I think the United States should keep bringing people in. We need immigration policy that makes sense, that serves our interests. We don't need immigration policy that's based on just whoever comes across the border. That's not, I believe in legal immigration. But I don't know about the people in this room. You know, my grandparents were immigrants. And, you know, when I was a kid, I remember my father saying to me, You see everything that's going on here? The Americans who were here before us, they made this, and they let us have it. And, I mean, I don't know, I'm tearing up a little bit. This country is magnificent. And I'm so proud of what it is, and I don't think that we should be worried about continuing that tradition that we've had. We should do it in a legal way, in an orderly way, in a way that serves American interests, but actually I think our population can keep growing. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. Thank you to Ambassador Storella for your wonderful insights, your stories. I love when these conversations are more fun than a dry conversation about policy and the exact stats and figures behind things. So I appreciate your...
Don't tell my mother-in-law anything I said about the French.
Well, we'll edit that out of the live stream for you. But thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you everyone who has supported this. We hope that you have all enjoyed it and that you'll join us on May 8th for our third and final in the T. William and Patricia Ayers Global Tipping Point series, which is going to focus on an America First approach to the world. So I think that'll be a really interesting conversation. And we hope you'll join us and bring your questions that you may have to better understand that approach and how it views the world. So thank you very much again, and we look forward to seeing you next time.